My name is Autumn Guillote. I am the field director for the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, and I also work very closely with the Institute for Labor Studies and Research, which is helping host these virtual lunch and learns. This is our second ever one. I'm very excited to have Alan Krinsky and Tom Sgouros here to talk about inflation. Alan is the Director of Research and Fiscal Policy at the Economic Progress Institute, and Tom is a research faculty member of the Computer Science Department at Brown University and a fellow at the Policy Lab. Two really smart, wonderful people to hear from today. And we're talking about inflation because we've been hearing about it for well over a year, about soaring inflation numbers, and then it went down a couple of months ago. And it's always a looming question of who's at fault, or what does this actually mean, or how does this actually impact us? Some folks will blame unions and blame organized labor for inflation, saying that driving wages up causes it. And now we're seeing strike actions as a direct result of the rising costs of living. So to unpack all of these big questions and these big issues, we have Alan and Tom, and I believe Alan's gonna kick us off here. And yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Autumn. I will share my screen here. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to participate in this and address this important topic. I just wanted to, okay, there we go. Show this just what we're going to cover. I'll just say a word or two about the EPI, and then we'll talk about the challenges of inflation and talk about it in terms of COVID, and then Tom will speak after addressing price controls and other issues, and then should be plenty of time for questions and discussion. Just a quick overview in case anyone's not familiar with the Economic Progress Institute. We're a non-partisan nonprofit that is focused on helping to improve the lives of low-income and modest-income Rhode Islanders. We do that through education, research, advocacy at the State House, and towards enacting policies that will help Rhode Islanders. And you can always go to our website, economicprogressri.org, for more information. We do a number of publications, including something like the this, you can see that candidate briefing book we did last year in preparation for the governor's race that shows some of the issues that are important to us. We're also involved in a number of coalitions and campaigns identified here, including the Revenue for Rhode Island, which was about increasing the creating a new tax on the top 1%, but we are active in other things like paid leave, childcare, healthcare issues, payday lending reform, in the past on minimum wage and EITC, in part, with labor partners on many of these. So I just wanted to start out, one of our major publications at EPI that we do every other year in even numbered years is the Rhode Island Standard of Need, which you can also find on our website. And in that we look at, and this is to get the foundation, what people need to make ends meet and where inflation can be a big issue. So what are the basic needs that Rhode Islanders have? How much does that cost? And do Rhode Islanders have the resources to meet those needs? And so a little under a year ago, we did our 2022 version of this, where we look at, we identify basic costs for housing, food, transportation, childcare, healthcare, and then some miscellaneous but necessary expenses, and look at what it takes. And some of these areas, the kind of thing that, especially housing, even as we're doing the housing numbers last year, rents are going up, and so it might be underestimating some of the costs people have, and certainly inflation and food has been an issue. Childcare is very expensive. So that's where people can really feel, I guess, some of the effects, and the RISN attempts to measure what's needed. And we also note differences by gender and by race, ethnicity in some of these, not necessarily the costs, but in the ability of people in different population groups to meet these to meet their basic needs and how challenging that can be. And one thing we look at is the minimum wage, which is something that is not controllable, but it's addressable at the state level in terms of state policy. Right now, Rhode Island's at $13 per hour, on schedule to move to 15 by 2025. Connecticut and Massachusetts already hit 15 this year. If the minimum wage were to have increased over the last 50 years with worker productivity, it would probably be about $23 per hour right now. So well above the sort of 13 we're at, the 15 that we're aiming for, we're on track to. And with the risen, we show how this was, a year ago, a single adult worker would have needed about $16.79 an hour then to meet their basic needs in terms of the income pre-taxes to meet their basic needs. Certainly, if you're talking about someone who has children, those expenses for childcare go up. It becomes even more difficult. But that's the kind of thing that we look at in the risen. And we also show how certain state and federal programs can help really bridge that difference, make that difference when we're dealing with these costs and with inflation to help make ends meet. And so those work supports can make a huge difference in terms of having enough money and not to make ends meet. Okay, turning to inflation and COVID. So just a disclaimer, I'm not a trained academic economist. I work on fiscal policy and taxation, state budget, but I'm not trained as an economist. Fortunately, I have national partners who are trained economists. Josh Bivens at the chief economist at the Economic Policy Institute, which same acronym as us, but one of our national partners. We call them Big EPI. He's written some excellent materials on inflation over the last year or two. And one of the things that he points out, and this co-author here, is that the inflation during COVID and also from Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, are global phenomena. People like to blame this politician or that politician or this policy or that. But it's really a global kind of thing, and it might be hard to see on this image, but the U.S., there are two red lines, red columns there. The one on the right is the non-U.S. average. The one on the left, the median U.S. average. The U.S. is right to the left of the non-United States average. So this is a global phenomena. It's not something, the inflation, it's not something particular to the U.S. that we can blame on something like the American Rescue Plan, which some people have done as putting all this money in the economy and causing inflation. This has been global. Different countries have addressed inflation with different kinds of responses and policies, and yet it's fairly widespread. So I don't think we can blame this, one policy or one politician or another for it. This chart shows how profit markups of prices due to profit have increased during the COVID period. You can see here they were at a sort of before say 2020, were in that sort of 12-13% range and have been much higher since COVID. So that increase in profit, increasing prices that increase profit have been a big thing. And so the next two charts are showing the same thing for slightly different time periods. But look at the different pieces that go into the growth of costs or to inflation. And so on this one, it's comparing the darker rows are during COVID, earlier part of COVID, compared to the 4 decades before that. And traditionally, increased labor costs have a much greater role in increasing prices. That's that sort of almost 62% line on the bottom. Whereas corporate profits are only responsible for about 11.4% on average of that increase in prices, and with non-labor inputs being in the middle. And we can see is that during COVID, at least this is during middle of 2020 through the end of 2024, that stuff gets flipped. That the cost of increased labor to inflation or these prices was only about 8% compared to the usual 62%, whereas corporate profits were over half of the explanation. So you can't really explain the inflation by referring to the increased costs of labor or blaming it on workers. That would be the data suggests that would be a real mistake, that there is much more here about increasing corporate profits. The second one shows a sort of similar thing. The comparison period is from 2007 to 2019, and then bringing the current period up through the Q4 of 2022. So some of those big differences have moderated a little bit, but still show that corporate profits are much higher, more than twice normal in terms of their explanation for increased prices, and labor, closer to half of what its traditional contribution is to this. And then the last thing I want to say before turning over to Tom is that, so we need to think about what are state level policy responses to inflation, because we're not necessarily in a position, with perhaps the exception of what, Tom might talk about price controls. A lot of this is a global phenomenon. It's something that's, maybe there are some federal responses to, but then we're thinking about, the risen and what people need to make ends meet. What can we do on the state level? We certainly can do things like, having a good response to unemployment and bolstering the unemployment system, for example. And then, one of the things that came up this year, I'll just mention, is cutting the sales tax, which on the one hand, one might think would be a very progressive kind of thing and would help people to make ends meet. When we looked at the proposals on the table and got some help from some of our national partners on examining the data, so in Rhode Island, we already exempt food and medicine and most clothing, except really expensive clothing purchases, from taxation. So cutting the sales tax doesn't make those things like food and medication any more affordable, or doesn't make rent more affordable for that amount. And so we looked, and the administration provided some averages of what people would save. But when you look at averages by income group, then it turns out that almost 40% of the tax benefit, the tax relief or benefit from cutting the sales tax, looks like it would go to the top 20% in income, whereas the lowest 20% will only get 6% of the benefit. An average of $13 per year based on the most modest proposal out there. And you can see some of the numbers here. And then the other piece of that is when you cut the sales tax, you're cutting revenue. So even though you might think it's more progressive to cut the sales tax, the amount of revenue that's cut, especially if we had dropped it down to 5%, would have been $463 million a year. And the kinds of programs that would have to be cut to fund that sort of thing could be much more damaging than any kind of savings benefit to low and modest income workers. So when we think about what state level policies are possible, we need to think about both sides of that, both the benefit, but then also the possible revenue cuts that might go into things. Anyway, just some ways you can stay connected with the Institute, and with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Tom. Be happy to answer questions later.
Well, cool. Thank you, Alan. I love the graphs, and I'm going to use one of them too. I also have a screen to share, so let me do that. People see something there? Okay. So let's see. So Autumn already introduced me. My name's Tom Sgouros, and I spend a lot of time. I am also not a trained economist, but I also think that a lot of trained economists don't have a lot to claim on that point. I'm not really sure what they get to, because one of the things, in order to talk about inflation, you sort of have to talk about economics. And whenever I start talking about economics, I always start with this, that people think about economics and they think, oh, economics, there's a lot of math. It's all about the math. And to an extent that's true, but really it's not. My favorite economists are the ones who understand that economics is really all about power, about who's got it, what they do with it. And you see economists drawing pictures of supply and demand curves, and the demand is supposed to shift over this way and the supply shifts over that way and the prices go this way. And they talk about it as if it's just a matter of plumbing, that the water flows this way. But that's not really what's happening, right? These are the effects of people who are making actual decisions. And when you talk about it in terms of plumbing and water pressure and things like that, it sort of relieves people from responsibility for the decisions, and that seems to me to be a bad idea. So the classic explanations for inflation have to do with a shortage or a surplus of money. And the idea here is that, we poured a bunch of money into the economy from the Inflation Reduction Act or from the COVID benefit money, and that's now there's more money chasing fewer goods, and so that's the argument. Milton Friedman was famously quoted once as saying, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." And Milton Friedman, yes, he has a Nobel Prize, but he also managed to demonstrate over and over again that he was full of baloney, right? That there really was not a lot of explanatory power in what he was actually talking about, because having too much money in the system affects people's decisions, but it's the people who are actually making the decisions. And you can see this too in just like the mechanics of how things work, right? It's one thing to say that, there's a lot of money in the system, and if you're at an auction and there's a lot of rich people who are bidding on whatever is happening, yeah, you can expect the prices to go up higher, and that's sort of the explanation of how things work. And there are actually a lot of prices in the U.S. economy that are based on auctions. Energy. There are routinely auctions involving energy. There are routinely auctions involving grain prices and other kinds of raw materials, metals. But there are a lot of prices that are not set by auction. Your dentist does not set prices by auction. The drugstores do not set prices by auction. Almost any service is not set by auction. These are people who have some market power and have some capacity to make a decision about what prices are actually being charged. So when people start to look into the decisions about what causes inflation, you hear a lot of talk about the expectations of rising costs. One mechanism that you hear often about is what they call the wage price spiral. And the idea here is that an increase in wages drives an increase in prices. The increase in prices in turn drives around the increase in wages. And that's a classic definition or a classic explanation of what rising prices are really about. But when inflation started happening in the U.S., in COVID a couple of years ago, you really had to think, well, now wait a minute. Does labor really have the power to push up prices? Yes, there's starting to be more labor action in the world. There are more strikes going on now than there have been in a long time. The UPS just settled their strike. The Writers Guild and the actors are on strike. There's action happening. Not to mention all the various moves against Amazon and against Starbucks and people like that. But I had to ask, when I first heard people talking about inflation and the wage price spiral, I thought, well, wait a minute. These are actions that are just like in process. We haven't seen them for 20 years, and now they're just starting to, 20 years, more than that. They're just starting to happen. Is it possibly true that these actions have been so successful already that they could be responsible for an increase in prices? And once you frame the question that way, the answer, it kind of answers itself. And that's why I was always on what economists jokingly call team transitory. People who think that what's happening here is a colossal shock to the worldwide economic system. And one of the ways that it reacted, as Alan pointed out, is in higher prices across the world as things shift around and suddenly because things are shifting around, suddenly goods are scarcer and people have opportunities to raise prices and take advantage of that. And that was the explanation that made much more sense to me than the idea that this sort of just beginning resurgence of labor power could possibly have the oomph to create this kind of classic wage price of spiral. And I think that the data that Alan shows makes it pretty clear that wages, like the great thing about looking at data, the great thing about theorizing is you can come up with different alternatives about what's actually happening. The great thing about data is that you can use that to choose among the alternatives. And the data that Alan showed from, the analysis of what's behind price increases, I think makes a pretty clear argument against the idea that this is impersonal forces of plumbing, price pressure created by the monetary supply, or that it has to do with the wages and prices pushing things up. No, it really has to do with the fact that lots of people selling stuff, lots of capitalists all over the world saw an opportunity to charge higher prices because of increased demand for their goods, and they took that opportunity. And I know you're shocked, but that appears to be what actually happened. And again, that's one of the great things about data, is it allows us the opportunity to choose among the sort of theoretical alternatives that have been set up, and this is the one that seems to make the most sense to me. But then the question is, so what do you actually do about inflation? I mean, it is sort of a problem. I mean, as the poster at the beginning and over here says, prices go up, people buy less, business slumps, people lose jobs, right? That's a cycle too. It's like the sort of the dark side of the wage price spiral. And so when you are faced with inflation, there becomes like a political question of all right, so what do we actually do about it? And so what I'd like to do for a moment is detour into history, because I think it's fun, and because I know that Autumn was a history major, and might appreciate it. But also because these are things that happened, but they're sort of unpopular with the current strands of economics, and so people are induced to forget them. So in recent history, in the 20th century, there are three really important episodes of price controls. Nationally imposed price controls. One of them was before the war, under Roosevelt, the NRA, the good NRA, was the National Recovery Administration, and this was a huge system of price controls passed by Congress in 1934, declared unconstitutional by the right-wing Supreme Court in 1935 or 36, and that led to the whole court packing thing. Anyway, that's a different digression. But what the National Recovery Administration did was establish a system of price controls, so that as Roosevelt dumped money into the economy with the other parts of the National Recovery Act and with the all the alphabet soup of the New Deal, so that prices would not run out of control. And in large part, for those first couple of years of the New Deal, in large part, it was successful. They actually did keep a lid on prices, and the GDP did grow a lot, and inflation did not actually happen. Economists then came back and said, oh yeah, well, that was because there was so much slack in the economy, it wouldn't have anyway. But the fact is that there was a pretty substantial effort to hold down prices, hold down some prices and hold up some other prices. So this is also the it was also the beginning of the minimum wage. The same act that created the National Recovery Administration also created the minimum wage, and also created support for farm prices, and was involved not only in trying to hold down consumer prices, but trying to hold up producer prices. If you imagine that it's holding down consumer prices and holding up producer prices, you can also imagine that the people who bought things from producers and sold things to consumers were very upset about it, and they're the ones. I mean, I know you're shocked, right? But they are the ones who complained and got it ended. Anyway, the next round of it was during World War II. The Office of Price Administration was established, again, to hold down prices against the fear of all the money that was being dumped into the economy for the war effort. And the Office of Price Administration had more time to establish itself, and it had some really important people behind it. They hired a ton of economists to actually do the work of trying to administer prices, and they did, and it worked. And again, it made the wrong people mad, and so after a couple of years, it was sort of defanged. But parts of it live on now. You know, these are the people who invented the how to measure GDP and all the other pieces of what we now think of as like the standard components of the national income accounting. Anyway, so they also again, there was a quite a substantial bureaucratic machine created in order to administer prices, and it worked. And again, it worked a little bit too well. The other time that people, at least people of my age, remember, is when in the 1970s, Richard Nixon ordered there to be a wage price freeze to fight that wage price spiral that he was seeing. And Nixon, of course, was an intelligent man, but he was a cynical, a cynic. He was a cynic. I'll leave it there. And you can tell right from the headline that it was doomed to failure, because look, Nixon orders 90-day wage price freeze, but at the same time, he's ordering tax cuts, and he severs the link between the dollar and gold, right? So the first thing is about containing prices. The second two things are creating inflation. Like he in an economic sense, the left and the right, you know, the ass and the elbow were just all mixed up with each other. And so it didn't really work. He also refused to control farm prices because he thought that would be unpopular where his electorate was. And if you look at the date on the newspaper, you'll see that it actually was from August of 1972. And really what that was about Richard Nixon getting reelected. And 90 days was roughly the distance between the order and the election day. And it had nothing to do with the economic sense of and it was just an economically nonsensical thing. Unfortunately, like many of these things, it became a symbol of the inadequacy or ineffectiveness of price controls. Even though we had these two very successful versions of it, we also, in our memory, have a pretty unsuccessful version of the same thing. Going longer back, everybody knows, for example, that China has a lot of people in it, but has anybody ever asked recently why China has so many more people than, say, Europe, which is like roughly the same size? And, you know, part of the reason turns out that China had a sort of an enlightened farm policy and enlightened prices that stretched back about 2,500 years. And they had what they call the ever normal granary. These were little systems of grain storage that were meant to iron out the fluctuations in farm prices from one year to the next, and to make sure that there was always rice on hand to prevent peasant revolts. And like, not only did it prevent peasant revolts, well, mostly it did, but it also made it possible for China's population to be like 3 times as much as Europe's was, even like 2,000 years ago. Similar things happened. Farm prices were a big subject in the, from like the 1870s. Well, I mean, further back, obviously further back than that, but in the U.S., they were a big subject nationally from the 1870s on. A guy in Texas, McCune, put together this plan in the 1870s for sub-treasuries, which were going to be a network of granaries, of ever-normal granaries, except he didn't realize that he'd stolen the idea from China, and he probably would have been offended if somebody had said so. That idea kind of lingered on into it. Henry Wallace, in Roosevelt's administration, actually did establish a system of grain purchases and storage for the U.S. government to hold up grain prices. A really interesting side note of this one is in North Dakota, the state actually established a grain elevator, a publicly owned grain elevator, and a state bank, a credit facility to go along with it in 1919. The state bank is no longer, it still does a little bit in agriculture, but it now does quite a bit more in all kinds of other stuff. But that's also basically an outgrowth of an attempt to control the prices of farm goods, not by holding them down, but by holding them up. John Maynard Keynes also had this really fascinating proposal in the about planning, about counter-cyclical planning and trying to control demand by, he had this idea about paying people in bonds that wouldn't mature for a couple of years, and that would be a way to give people a raise without actually affecting the money supply. Anyway, like a lot of Keynes's ideas, it was a fascinating idea that we'd be in a much better place if it had been adopted, but he made the wrong people mad. And then I think it's also worth pointing out not just the price control history, but how price controls actually are an everyday part of our lives today. We already talked about the minimum wage, and that is an obvious thing to talk about in terms of inflation. I don't know how many people realize how regulated the insurance industry is. You often don't notice it because there is no federal insurance regulator. It's all regulated at the state level. But the state level insurance regulation is huge. There is a bureaucracy in every state in the country whose job is to hold insurance prices up. Because the problem that they were trying to solve was the problem from the late 19th century that people were selling insurance that was too cheap to actually work. And so they established this system, and it's a uniform system, but it's done by all the different states. Utility regulation is also a way that we do price controls. And then tax policy, as Alan alluded to. I mean, the gas tax is part of it. We don't tax building materials that go into buildings. And then another one that economists hate, but is probably for bad reasons, is rent control. What you learn from the history of price controls is that to make it work requires a lot of state capacity, right? The Office of Price Administration created this substantial bureaucracy to do it. The bureaucracy that ran rent control in Cambridge there were a lot of people involved in holding down the rents in Cambridge, and there was a lot of careful thought had to go into the design of the regulation and making it actually work. But I think the important things about rent control are to point out that not rent control, but price control generally, including rent control, is that these controls are far more commonplace than most people think, right? But that they do require some capacity and careful planning to actually make them work. But more than any of that, what I want to leave you with is the idea that these are realistic options for public policy. There are lots of economists who will tell you that, oh no, you can't do that because it's gonna ruin the supply. It's going to create demand. It's going to create demand where you don't need it. But the fact is that there are lots of markets in which it has been determined through trial and error that price controls are valuable, and we live with them all the time. Adding others seems to me to be not actually that radical an option. And that, I think, is pretty much what I have to say about these things. I hope it's not actually the end of these things, but I will stop sharing and shut up and thank the Institute and Autumn for hosting this. And now let's talk. Who's got questions?
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments.